Okay, hello and welcome. We're starting the panel discussion, which is the last one in the series on contemporary practices in the Middle East. And the series of public events has been part of the FAAH 229E course, the same title, Contemporary Practices from the Middle East. And the events are facilitated, supported and sponsored by the university's Deans and Provost's office. And the question today that we will be asking is what is to be done with art education? And before we start the discussion, I will present the general framework, and then each of the participants will have time to present some experiences and thoughts on the matter, after which we'll engage in a discussion and we'll open it up to the audience. And I want to start with the notion of the rupture that has taken place with the advent of the avant-garde between art and artisanal skills. It has, because there's been a displacement of the link between handicraft and skill, and dissociation of art from artisanal production skills. But the ways in which the dialectic of skill and de-skilling is grounded, it in itself is grounded in the division of labor from productive labor to non-productive labor, in which at the moment we mostly operate in the conditions of non-productive labor and the production of immaterial goods, which is the knowledge economy, economy based not on the production of material goods, but of thoughts of immaterial products. And I mean, it seems to me that what is at stake is the rupture between the expressive unity of hand and eye, which is overridden by the techniques of social reproducibility. And this rupture has resulted also the polarization of the way in which art education has positioned itself, at least since the 60s. Because on the one hand, in the context of the Fine Art Academy, we still have an instruction system, a system based on instruction that teaches artisanal skills. But on the other hand, there has been also a mushrooming of educational initiatives that focus on so-called social practices. So like in the US and in the UK specifically, there have been a lot of art programs on social practice as such. So what seems to be at stake is the rupture between skills and de-skilling. But the question I want to ask today is it possible that de-skilling itself is a skill in the conditions, again, of immaterial labor? But more specifically, coming to the context we are in, the larger regional context, what kind of art initiatives exist, both formal art education within the studio art programs of liberal art universities, liberal art programs, but on the other hand also formal art education of art schools. But at the same time, what is the relationship between formal art education and the informal art programs, informal art initiatives that have been emerging in the last few years by institutions, facilitated by institutions such as the Townhouse Gallery in Cairo, Ashkal Alwan in Beirut, and Sadek in Baghdad. So we will be asking more general questions, but coming back to the specificity of our practices and experiences and thoughts. So the main line of investigation is basically what is the relationship between formal art education and informal art education, educational initiatives in the context of de-skilling. So I will now turn to my left. Perhaps Walid would like to start presenting some thoughts on the framework of the panel. Just before that, apologies, I want to present my colleagues, of course. Walid Sadek is a well-known figure at AUB and in the larger scene in Beirut. He teaches architecture and design courses at the Department of Graphic Design and Architecture, and he's an artist and theoretician and a thinker. And Regine Sahakian, has established a new art initiative in Baghdad, which is a workshop for artists. And Christine Tohme, she's the director of Ashkal Alwan. Ashkal Alwan has started the Home Space program, which invites participants from all over the world to engage in critical thinking in production of art within the span of 1 year. And Shady El-Noshokaty teaches studio art courses at the American University in Cairo, and he's also an artist, and he's starting his own foundation called ASCII, which is focused on media art and research. So we'll start from Walid.
Okay, thank you. All right. I wrote a very short text that I'd like to read about, again, the notion of de-skilling, which, I mean, for many years I took it for granted. But recently it's become increasingly troubling as I am faced with the question of how does one teach art? So these are a few thoughts on what I consider to be a very troubling notion, de-skilling, and they may be somewhat inconclusive, but I hope that in the conversation we can perhaps elaborate further. So it may no longer be a debatable question elsewhere, but for art education programs in Lebanon and perhaps in other Arab nations, it remains a thorny question. It is the question of de-skilling. What is de-skilling? Simply said, it is a process which requires a concerted effort at ridding oneself, even perhaps liberating oneself, from a set of skills and the histories which they hold and often safeguard. De-skilling, therefore, is more than a notional claim. It is an active singeing of the self, both a conceptual shift and a corporal marking, to show, without any lingering doubts, especially when in the presence of others, that one is rid of a set of historical skills, even if one is expected to momentarily and perhaps admirably suffer through a series of withdrawal symptoms. So de-skilled is how an artist is supposed to stand, as an apostate to what remains of his own discipline, nomadically moving in the unmarked spaces between one disciplinary boundary and another, an amateur of utopias, who might call them, an intellectual constantly driven by a relation with absence, an extra-disciplinarian, as Stephen Wright argues. De-skilled is the term, it is the new term, the term of a new justness, without which an artist remains caught in a false dialectic. To recall Benjamin Buchloch's critique of Gerhard Richter, a false dialectic where the artist tries to transcend the limitations of a historical medium through the material conditions of that same medium. But where and when does one de-skill? How is the new justness of de-skilling recognized, and by whom? And is it necessarily before the law of a non-conventional art institution? Recall with me, if you will, a painting by the Venetian Titian titled The Flaying of Marsyas from around 1570. The painting depicts the fate of the satyr Marsyas, who, according to some accounts, challenged the god Apollo to a musical contest. Marsyas, we are told, excelled at playing the olos, which was a double-piped reed instrument that was actually discarded and cursed by its inventor, the goddess Athena, after the other gods made sport of how her cheeks bulged when she played it. Judged by the muses, Marsyas lost the contest with Apollo, even if he, it is said, outplayed the god. The punishment for his supposed hubris was brutal. Marsyas was flayed alive. He was de-skinned alive. Why such an extreme sentence for one who supposedly excelled at the established art of music and proven himself meriting the company of gods? Is it because of his hubris? Perhaps. But allow me to follow another interpretive course. Marsyas's horrible punishment cannot be justified by his excessive genius musicality. At worst, such genius could have been reprimanded and then recuperated by the authority of the god and reframed as the talent of a singular apprentice. So rather, I would propose that Marsyas's punishment was equal to what was rightly perceived as an irreverent and perilous descent. Marsyas came forth with the quote-unquote skill of playing an instrument which was cursed by the goddess Athena, an instrument derided by a company of gods, and with it, he challenged the orthodox skills of the god Apollo. In other words, Marsyas challenged Apollo not by outplaying him in that same orthodox skill of which the god was the exemplar, but rather by attempting to deflate the edifice of that Apollonian skill with a non-skill, because maligned and denigrated. So Marsyas is a figure who de-skilled himself, right, before the god of perfected skill. That is not mere impudence, it's much more. It's a blatant challenge to an authority, and for that he was de-skinned. Now, a very quick excursus on the side. I think that Marcel Duchamp is probably the one artist who learned very well the lesson of Marsyas, for he was quick to change his skin several times following the exhibition of his infamous urinal. Among these skins, let us remember Rose Sélavy, the consummate chess player, and of course the posthumous maker of art and art openings. Now, to return. So to wish for a punishment as brutal as that of Marsyas is probably no longer possible today. De-skinning for de-skilling is almost unthinkable. And yet consider again the fate of a local artist whose name is now practically lost except for very few. He was active during the late 1980s and early 1990s, a time before art institutions and well before any foreign interest in Lebanese post-war art. By 1993, he had already staged and videotaped his own death as an artist, had already burned some of his work and wrecked others. He had already used the debris of his paintings and sculptures to make ephemeral installations. He had already turned his atelier into a heap of rubbish without an inventory. He had already appeared in a short documentary broadcast on Future TV and directed by a group of amateurs, among them the then barely known and very young Rabi Amroui. And he even had already appeared in public and at art openings with his left hand and forearm painted with gold leaf. An arm, he said, hit by a bullet and rendered useless. His name is Imad Isa, and I have not seen or heard of him in 15 years, except for two of his destructured paintings which appeared in a group exhibition titled The Road to Peace at the Beirut Art Center in 2009. But considering what he had already accomplished, in other words, considering that he had already de-skilled, my question is that why is he not with us today? And why does he not appear on the rosters of Ashkal Alwan, the Elul Art Festival, the Beirut Theater, the Sharjah Biennale, you name it, or on that of other main loci of contemporary art? Of course, my question does not seek a restitution of the artist Isa, nor is it a reprimand of any of these art institutions or their directors, far from it. Rather, the question attempts to understand what the significance of Isa may be for us today as an artist who de-skilled in the absence of an orthodox law, in the absence of a god, Apollo, and prior to the later contemporary art institutions who may have welcomed and celebrated him. Isa de-skilled alone, with only a few friends to witness, and in doing so, had to live through the full consequences of his act. Not punished by an established law, nor celebrated by rising new lawmakers. He de-skilled without encountering the seemingly necessary density of an institution capable of giving material reality to his acts. But before we rush into the conclusion that de-skilling is inconsequential without an institution to give it visibility, let us persist with the Imad Isa who disappeared. The reappearance of two of his paintings in the exhibition at the Beirut Art Center 3 years ago is inconsequential because his work was framed as part of a body of very poorly documented work made during the Civil War of 75 to 1990. If in that exhibition Isa surfaces, he does so as a document from a past which is not a primary concern for contemporary art except as a document to be archived and then reconfigured. But not the Isa who de-skilled and performed some of what would later be made by other artists and traveled the circuits of biennales, often with much ado. Instead, he disappeared with an arm and a hand painted with gold, an embodied marker of kind of a sacral paralysis and useless skill, the marker of an end game, without hope and another beginning, under the aegis of the nascent other laws of new contemporary art institutions. As a coda, historians tell us that Edouard Manet wrote to Charles Baudelaire a letter in which he complains of the intractable popular misunderstanding and venomous critical dismissal of his work. Baudelaire, the poet, responded, harshly rebuking the artist for forgetting that he is nothing but the first in his art's decrepitude.
Thank you, Walid. And I think we can engage with some of these thoughts after the presentations. And another thing that I wanted to add is in a sense kind of an amnesia about the specificity of the medium that the post-Duchampian paradigm of contemporary art is based on, in which the engagement with the medium itself is lost in this notion of de-skilling. But then, like, how do you retract that memory without erasing again what happened after Marcel Duchamp? This is a question that I'm not inventing, but was also asked in the recent book that Rosalind Krauss surprisingly wrote, Under the Blue Cup, in which she associates the actual car accident that she had, and she had the memory loss, temporary memory loss, and she associates the coming back of the memory through therapy to the recalling of the engagement with the medium and in its own specificity in pre-Duchampian art history. But we'll come back to these questions, and I'll ask Christine now to present some thoughts, if you're ready, and your experience with an educational structure that you established and you're running, and some of the perhaps challenges you're facing. But it's your time. You can feel free not to respond to questions as well.
Okay. First, I'm very happy to be in my campus today. After a very long time, I'm 20 years of graduation, and I would have loved to have more people here. Of course, this is something that I would like to start with about the problem of diffusion in education and generosity. Diffusion, generosity, and being able to create this collectivity. Meaning, two main issues comes to my mind when I hear Walid talking about Imad Isa, a very good friend. And I think his golden hand has ruled the world. Whether institutions has taken him on or not, I think his poetry has taken over all of us. And when I see his videos where he documented the death of downtown Beirut, marching with his friends, late Majid Assir, who died a month ago, and Barbara, and all these people, and Greta Naufal, who documented Beirut when we were even barely dealing with our lives and struggling to have a kind of peaceful corner. And there wasn't all the galleries and the institutions and the buzz on the Arab world to be hijacked or kidnapped by anybody. So here I would start that we cannot really dissociate education and academia from the art market. And the art market is a complete circle. So when we talk about the art market, we have to produce artists. Producing artists entails aggression. Aggression entails a market. It entails art criticism. It entails a spectatorship that is part of a marked commodity. Academia is part of this marked commodity. Imad Isa has been, but he decided to leave. We did not decide to leave. All of us here, we are part of this game, and we will always be. Institutions, specifically, an institution like AUB, which for me has graduated me, I owe them a lot. But what did AUB give me as a student? They gave me a lot. They taught me a lot. Walid Khairallah taught me a lot. George Khairallah taught me a lot. Elias Khouri taught me a lot. But there's something that AUB did not teach me. It's being crazy, because it is such an informal institution. And a formal institution that is trying everything to create shaped creatures, shaped, polite, and by the system, and not capable of beating a system that only produces commodities. So when we talk about formal education and informal education, one most important thing, I don't consider Ashkal Alwan has created an academy, nor did Ashkal Alwan has created a university, nor did Ashkal Alwan has created a school. It only created a space for facilitation, a space for diffusion, a dream that Imad Isa has dreamt of. A space that does not pretend that will change the face of education or academia in Beirut, because all these universities are doing a great job, starting from AUB, which is the most important for me, which is my university, reaching Alba, reaching Jesuit, reaching the Lebanese University, reaching the Arab University. I think something very important for me comes to mind here is when we talk about this skilling and about all of these components, that boundaries and de-skilling and craftsmanship and artisanat and education and conceptual art and critical art, these are boundaries that have been created by Western institutions. For once, this skilling is very important, but it's also important to create this fusion, this fluidity that without it, we cannot do anything, because we will always be falling a trap under labels. What does it mean to teach conceptual art? What does it mean to teach critical art? What does it mean to be a great sculptor and a great painter? And I think we miss great painters and sculptors in our world. So this is a very important thing that we need to be careful of. When we put all these boundaries, we have to be careful that we are only creating labels. That part of this labeling is becoming the mediocrity of the art world. That without having a label and without educating and, without graduating these students, that we declare great artists, and then they come to the art world, and then from the art world they graduate and they become in all these festivals and biennales. What about artists who did not go to universities? What about somebody like Ghassan Salhab? What about all these artists that I think are amazing artists but have never gone into academia? And here, if I'd like to talk about Ashkal Alwan, it is a space that we have created, a space of facilitation and reflection. It is a space for creating and reflecting upon questions that become sometimes difficult to answer, upon all the pressure that is put by the market. And I always will connect a market to the economy, because when we graduate artists, we are graduating them to be part of this pyramid. We declare them artists, and then they enter this world of market, and hence we can have art critics, and hence we can have universities and academia. Without this, if we don't have this economy of production, we cannot have academia. So if I want to talk about our project is a very modest project that will give the space, that has given the space for 12 to 15 participants every year to come and think of questions that are still unanswered to them, questions that are difficult to answer under the pressure of production, because you are always asked as an artist to produce, to cater for a market, to produce, to create a whole cyclical system, being part of Documenta or Manifesta or Ashkal Alwan or you name it, or Townhouse Gallery. So these are spaces that we need more and more. The spaces that are really spaces where you are supporting artists to think, and not to think of boundaries between being a sculptor or a painter or being a critical artist or a critical writer. I think this will take us nowhere. This fluidity and seepage is what is needed in our art world. But these gadgets, I consider them gadgets, have been created, as we say, agency, and as we say, an institution with an independent study program. I don't know what these labels mean. So here, I would say that academia, in a way, has to be more giving possibilities to people who are coming from deprived backgrounds, political and economical. If we think of what's happening in the Netherlands at the moment, and this is a big question for all of us, all these programs like Das Arts, Rijksacademie, Jan van Eyck are being privatized. They're being privatized because of all the political and economical gestures that are happening in the world. I'm not going to go into the post-colonial, post-Marxist, capitalist scenarios now, because it will take us another 2 days. I'm just going to say that for me, a part of academia is to be able to create pockets of diffusion and pockets of reflection, pockets that are not related specifically to a market, pockets that are not related to a delivery, pockets that are not related to graduation, but pockets where these artists are being able to contemplate and reflect upon their work. And even when we give them these chances, they will be always ruled by a market. And hence, for me, economy of production is the most component and is the most important component of education.
Thank you, Christine. And in relation to also your practice, I'd like to now turn to Shady El-Noshokaty, who has been, in a way, operating in the gray zone in Cairo between the governmental art scene and the so-called independent art scene, which has been artificially polarized from each other, as if the governmental art scene is produces basically already legitimized artist bureaucrats with a certain tradition of an art school, whereas the contemporary art scene is this hub of free thinking, criticality. But throughout Shady's practice, it becomes clear, as both as an artist and as a pedagogue, that this polarization is at best artificial. And I'm referring both to your practice within the Academy of Fine Arts, the Faculty of Art Education in Alwan University, where you started a series of informal media art workshops within the academy, but also the way in which you deal with your students, which is an engagement beyond the classroom. And I'd like you to share some of these experiences, and in this context, perhaps talk about the way in which maybe the art school is not this formal building with bricks and the roof on top of it, but the art world is a school in itself, in which the transmission of knowledge and the transmission of skills is much more dynamic and elastic than the environment of an art school would predict or would allow.
Okay, I would like to thank you all and for coming. And it's my this is my I was here for almost 10 years ago, working with Christine, and now it is maybe my second time to be here in Lebanon. I'm very excited. So thank you all for being honored to be here in AUB. So I try to be maybe more focused on my personal practices as an art educator. Being educated and graduated from very traditional art academy like Faculty of Art Education, and it's one of the Faculty of Art Education is one of the three major art schools in Egypt: Faculty of Art Education, Faculty of Fine Art, and Faculty of Applied Art. And there's many, of course, different in different city. But the thing is, I start to be more interested about education and art education as parallel practice to my practice as an artist, and trying to find a link between being an artist who teach. I always have that kind of question when I was even as a student, and of course I didn't get in the school what I really hoping or dreaming to get. But I think there's one thing I got from the school, that experimentation, and this could be one of the things which take you out of that freeze context in that buildings. So I start to find a way to getting more education in States and get back. And as soon as I get back, I was carrying all that load of how I'm gonna go back with that system to work again and start to accept it as a teacher who been graduated from the same system. Of course, I have my own practice in my own work, which is gradually starting to have another line completely away from what I already taught, which by time I start to use more conceptual language. I start to learn actually more about using that research-based process, which I never learned, I never used before. So actually, when I get back, I start to find my focus was recent last 10 years was on new media and discovering new ways or new language to show self or talk about self as a base of art. And of course, under that system, it is very extremely difficult. So my question was how I enter that system to create another system to maybe in the future could break it and change it. That was I think this was my first idea, how I could do that. And let's remember that the system is very well structured, very, very well structured. And they don't allow anyone to even go and try to propose some other ideas. So my main idea is to create as a workshop. And for me, I remember when I started to educate in Chicago Art Institute, I stayed there for 1 year, and I was just visiting students from Fulbright as a Fulbright scholar. And I remember that maybe one of the very first exciting, effective thing, that was one of the workshops which I participated in 3 different artists, a musician, and a writer, and a cinematography artist. So I started to get back and said, okay, those systems, which doesn't allow the student to select their teachers, it doesn't allow the student to even to select what they study. It's just a package, and they have it or leave it. And all that disaster which came out of that, losing the aim of being educated itself. So I get back and we start to open that workshops. And actually the workshop, of course I cannot deny that without the allowance of me to create that workshop, it wouldn't happen. So I have to agree that they allow me to take the students, the classroom to create a workshop, which is begin a series of hopes and dreams to maybe this workshop build its own structure, which actually based on inviting artists who are maybe self-taught. Also, those artists were all my friends. They came from nothing, without paying anything. They didn't get any kind of money because actually this workshop was not funded at all. So, and we did it with our hope, just with our dream that this could be happening. So the workshop gradually start to be more and more taking the place in that system every summer, 1 month in a summer, and it starts from 2000 until last year. So this workshop start to continue for the last 10 years. And every summer, it was another challenge of making it as an education program. And for us, another question which coming very strongly, how, if our main focus is to create a system or a curriculum which based on media art education, how we can educate, how we can create that curriculum in a ground which is not prepared for it. Egyptian culture and Egyptian young artists, they're using, or young scholars, they know about media, they use equipments, they use video and photography, and they do that, but actually there is no kind of base, there's no information. Most of them don't speak English, so most of the information which they create that kind of base, which they can build their own experience, is not there. So this is, I think, was made challenge. How we can create an education system which all of it was based on a base which is not there, from culture side or practical side. So I think that was the main challenge. So we start to create that system which is built its own by its own. So it's actually the older teach the younger, and that's how we start from the ground. And that's how we started. And I invite many of my friends who have that experience of self-taught to teach them how they did it, because that's the only thing they can do. They have to use their own experience to read or to make experiments or whatever, to learn, just to learn that amount of experience, and then maybe later in the second summer, they add to it and they add to it another experience, and maybe they can teach it to younger. So it's like a military system. It's like the older teach the younger. And this is how it's been built in the last 10 years. And actually that is the only way we find, or I find, actually I don't find, but it's just happened that way. It wasn't planned that system growing in the system, in the university, in that structure that way. Because it is just happening that we push it very hard, that we have to do it this year. We have to do it, and it has to be done. So I think that was my own experience of trying to find a system which use completely different kind of teaching or gaining. Let's do this. It's not a teaching, because workshop is not about a teacher who having this position in a classroom, but it's all about creating that environment of sharing and discussion and screening and analyzing. And this is a thing which they never do. So we create that kind of space and environment, which I think it succeeded very well. Most of the students, this is another thing which maybe make it very unique and very special, that most of the students which participate in those workshops, actually they're just ground students. The students which they never think that they can use this kind of language in their life. The students who came from other cities which they never think that maybe they'll become an artist one day. So this was the real, this is a very strong part of it. Some of the students never think that they'll be an artist, which they become an artist. And this is that's very, very important. Maybe selection, which is actually the criteria of creating the selection, which is not functioning here, because most of the students which we work with, it's just a ground which they never think about. So I think this is something which is very, very important under creating that kind of system in the system, which working with a ground, which I find it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult and challenging to go in a system, trying to work from the ground and build on that experience, which take years. And now I can find like, yes, this experiment but it takes 10 years to see that it's something coming out of it. Which also have an open source lab with media and electronics. And ASCII educational paper will all about it will be educational paper which have all translated text and information about contemporary art, which is, I think this is also will help in parallel. Actually, this year, this is next July, we will organize the 11th workshop. And this year will be the 11th workshop. And actually, we're doing it parallel between ASCII and Faculty of Art Education, which I believe it will take that program into completely another level. Thank you.
Thank you. In relation to your work, what is interesting is that, like, precisely the fact that your artistic practice and your classroom practice intersect in ways that sometimes are indistinguishable. And I'm thinking of like Stammer Classroom that we used as the image of the poster, which is a video done with students, but also the way in which the classroom, in a sense, becomes an artwork in itself. And it reminds me also like the very way in which the number of students grows around the workshop reminds me of Malevich's notion of art education, of art through contamination, through infection, actually. And the art school becomes basically this prerequisite in which the bacilli travel from one to the other. So, I mean, I think the workshops had that effect of creating an environment rather than a structure of engagement and collaboration in media art practices. So I'll turn now to Regine. Actually, I know very little about what you're doing about Sada. Outside of Kayleen Wilson-Goldie's article, I know very little. So perhaps like you could present, and you could also present some thoughts of why Baghdad and what kind of gap are you trying to fill, and what is the structure of the workshops that you're doing.
Thank you. I think a lot of what Shady was saying actually relates to some of the work that we're doing. I think I'm going to break this. No, that's okay. I'll just move over here. But I'll start first with a little bit of a background about Sada itself. We basically, Sada is a nonprofit foundation that we started about 1.5 years ago. And it was sort of organized to serve almost as a de facto arts council for Iraq, and it quickly sort of started changing into becoming more of a program that focused on education inside of Baghdad itself, and with students who were working and attempting to practice there and practicing in their own ways. That sort of grew out of my own trips and taking more time in Baghdad and being able to go more often and working with the students there, particularly at the academy. What we've been doing so far is doing workshops with students, somewhat similar, I think, to what is happening in Egypt, but quite differently in terms of the environment and the different sort of programmings that we've had to do to make adjustments in relation to the fact that it is still not a secure kind of city. It's still a place that a lot of people don't have access to, and a place that even a lot of the Iraqi artists who are living in the diaspora and doing workshops with the students aren't willing to go to because of these kinds of concerns. At the same time, we're still dealing with a population that is very much in flux, and with a sort of environment that is still changing rapidly, and also with an institution that has been sort of obviously not functioning in a very effective way for some years, but in the past 10 years has also faced some enormous structural issues, flight of professors, the looting of the academy itself, a lot of destruction of materials, and all of these major shifts that have contributed to the sort of environment and sort of background of the environment of students that we're working in now. So we started with sort of trying to get around this issue of how do we sort of work with students at the academy there and young artists who have a great deal of work that they are already working on, but don't really have access to a lot of the resources and educational materials that are available that is taking place in the arts right now. And then also having a really valuable resource of Iraqi artists that are living in the diaspora and are doing very interesting and critical work and have education experience and would like to work with students there and sort of assist in sort of making further work possible that's coming from inside of the country itself. So because we had this sort of geographic issue of artists not being able to go, we decided that we would have to do a sort of online program, and it's been a pilot. It's been happening for the past year. And what we did was basically in Iraq, we arranged for a classroom to be set up at the Film Center, which is an alternative space than the academy itself, because at that point we still weren't sure about any government involvement and wanting to sort of be under the radar a little bit. And so we worked with the Independent Film and Television College, assembled a classroom there, and started organizing classrooms and online sessions where we developed a kind of software that the teaching artists could use from wherever they were based, whether, you know, and they were based in cities, they are based in cities all over the world, and then a projector inside of the classroom in Baghdad where students from the academy or young students or between the ages of 19 and 30 could go to the classroom and receive sort of online lectures from professors and teaching artists and sort of communicate in real time. So we've been doing that for the past year, and we've obviously been learning a lot, and there's some shifts that will take place, but it has been one of the only ways that we've been able to do any real kind of programming with the students in Baghdad until, of course, and this may change, obviously, if things become more stabilized and artists are able to actually go to Baghdad itself and feel comfortable working in the country. So that's one of the main projects that Sadek has been undertaking. We're also doing a few exhibitions and programs. We'd like to focus more on documentation and sort of translation and assembling of materials because this is sort of in response to the lack of materials that are sometimes available or the lack of sort of housing structures that can accumulate this kind of material that is an important resource for these artists and others who are doing sort of studies or investigative work and practices on the city of Baghdad itself or on Iraq or on a number of different issues that are cited there. And this kind of, I think, this issue of sort of assembling documents or study or enabling that kind of practice is something that I think is quite critical when we discuss Baghdad itself right now and sort of the issues that the students are working with. I think that, I think Christine made an important point when she was discussing these sort of labelings of different artists and if they are critical artists or working in critical art, conceptual, skilled, unskilled sculpture, whatever it might be, because I think that at the point that we're in, that's something, first, I think there's a lot of individual choice. I think that artists can make those choices and can work in a very fluid way and often do. But I think that also one of the most important aspects of art making right now and one of the tools that the fact that the field is so wide gives us right now is that you can sort of take from an enormous toolbox or set of concepts or ideas or whatever you want to utilize in order to make different kinds of meanings and sort of make different kinds of information accessible by reformatting that or using work in a way that can act as a different kind of knowledge production. And in the case of Iraq, and then particularly with the students, this becomes extremely heightened. I mean, I think for anyone, but it's something that I've really noticed with students there because they are living in the city and come out of an environment where there is a huge amount of knowledge that's being made or information being shared about where they're from through images, through visual productions that are not necessarily their own or coming from a place that's cited there. And so using those kinds of tools that are available to make those kinds of experiments or research or productions happen from the place itself takes on an even more a heightened level of importance, I think, and it's something that a lot of the students, regardless of the fact that they haven't necessarily gone through MFA programs or there aren't very many of substance available to them now, are very much aware of and sort of looking towards as well. So I think that there's a number of these issues that may sort of make sense in some arenas, but not necessarily in different contexts. And I think that, also, this is possibly something that's shared in the Arab world, possibly shared with a number of different areas where different kinds of practices are being taken on in alternative spaces or different ways because of the different governments or environments that students or artists are situated within. But I think that it's definitely a key issue in relationship to how students interact with their work and how the concept of working is really seen. And I think, one of these issues with academia versus non-academia is that if you're a student and you're working and the only options that you have are necessarily object-based or skilled forms, you're also, in some cases, losing out on an opportunity to sort of make this a sort of long-lasting and lifelong endeavor in a space where you can work in a particular kind of way. And I think this is also where the market comes into play, where certain artists are being, or certain areas are being groomed for a certain kind of artwork that can then sort of go into a market and be consumed in a kind of way, but not necessarily, but they're not necessarily having access to the kinds of work or research or undertakings that can actually allow for different kinds of meanings and information to be unveiled or worked on for longer amounts of time or in a more substantive way. What else? I think that also one of the things I wanted to mention is that in regards to the issue, I think of some of the basic skills that go into knowledge, and I think Shady brought this up in terms of English language and other sorts of skills. This is also something that I'm interested in discussing and I think is often not discussed. I think there's this excitement, there's an excitement among some about the Arab art market and also like a lot of trepidation around it by others. But at the same time, there's, I think this lack of a sort of background or environment for learning that really does exist in a number of places. I mean, you talked about it in terms of the students that you're working with. I have seen it, of course, with students in Iraq who don't have access to certain tools or skills that they would need in order to facilitate any kind of competition or sort of working in a way that can be, and I'm in competition in a way that they'll have access to a way of sort of working that makes sense in a global art field or even in a regional one. There seems to be missing this whole idea of what are the institutions that can come about, where are certain kinds of art schools. Art schools may function in one way that's beneficial for some and not for others, but the fact of the matter is, at least for a number of students, and particularly for these, there are virtually no spaces for that learning to take place. And I think that in a field where the idea is that contemporary art can respond in certain ways and be very fluid and sort of elastic. I mean, in the case of Iraq in particular, where you had a major campaign against the arts and against culture in the country that was very targeted and very specific, there was very little in terms of response to what was taking place or to people who were involved in cultural production or cultural work there, or the kinds of sort of issues that were going on, and I think that stands to this day. I mean, there was a little bit of work done in terms of preserving sort of older paintings or antiquities and this kind of thing, but there was virtually nothing else or very little in terms of any sort of debate or sort of presentations or responses to this, or action or movement, I think. So in that sense also, I think these kinds of efforts or endeavors, however far they might go, are, they're modest. At least this project is modest. It's obviously not going to, solve, this is a much larger problem. But it's sort of a step in this idea of how different sort of sites, and I think it's important that we have a specificity of each city that we're talking about here, is actually able to produce their own actors in terms of creating the kind of work that can produce real meanings or objects of visual culture or long-standing sorts of research towards that in an independent or creative sphere.
Thank you all. I'm going to start with the first question, but I don't want to be the only one asking questions. I want to address to Walid, since you're an expert on time and temporality, I'm wondering, how do you reconcile the imperative for the artist to engage with time in a non-instrumental way with the fact that, within the university curriculum, there are very specific, very limited temporal constraints imposed on studio work, on art education. So I'm wondering, what do you see your role within this duality of, on the one hand, elastic temporality, non-instrumentalized temporality that the artist work entails with the instrumental time of the institution? You're welcome to ask another question.
You want my expert opinion? May I disagree with the question? I think we can do two things today. I think it seems to me we can either talk of how to make better spaces, to make better art education, right? Or to question the whole thing from scratch. I'd rather do the second, right? So I'd rather do the second one, right? So in other words, so we can perhaps talk, how does one structure an art curriculum? What kind of studio relation between, teacher, student, so forth, which are all very important questions, I think probably very, very needed. Or we can simply begin by quickly confessing that, we are talking of two systems that have failed terribly, art and education. So let's take things from where from where it hurts, right? Art has failed terribly. I speak it as a Lebanese artist, and generating any ability to make changes. And as a university professor, I know education has failed miserably, and I struggle with it every day. So, what do? We make a better curriculum, or we begin to think the impossible, perhaps, knowing that we'll all try, come tomorrow and keep our job, right? I'll teach tomorrow as well. But that's not what keeps me alive, right? I mean, it's not what keeps the possibility of another horizon alive. I need to think differently. So, if I bring up the figure of Imad Isa, and of course, without any, interest and I hope no one will ask me after the talk of, information about Imad Isa, okay? Because I have none, I will not answer, okay? But the figure of Imad Isa is a unique figure because it's a figure that neither could agonize against a powerful institution, the law, right, against the canon, right? Nor is it a figure that, like many others, had been fortunate enough to blossom, right, within another kind of institution. What do you call it? Environment, spaces. I don't believe in all these distinctions. I think we are inevitably makers of institutions, unfortunately. But Imad Isa, as a figure, is someone who de-skilled for no apparent reason. There was no one to fight against and no one to welcome him. And there's something about him, something about the way that he expended himself. There's a kind of waste to that figure, which is really interesting. It really makes me want to reconsider what I do as an artist and what I do as an educator. And through that, perhaps, and I don't have answers right now, but I need to think about it, but to think again the temporality of expenditure within institutions, and if that's possible to somehow provoke, right, these kinds of temporative expenditure. So maybe I came back to your question. Apologize, it took a while.
No, I want to talk about something else.
Yes, please.
I want to talk about when we talk about academia and education and creating all these spaces and environments where, as if there's this promise that you are going to create something else, that they are completely disconnected and that you are going to kind of create an independent program. When you are going to start thinking of a program, you have to think of everything that we have inherited for the past 100 years. So you cannot really say, I am doing a program in Beirut or in Cairo or in Iraq, and giving the environment or the facilitation or the space for artists when you have a heritage and a legacy that are on your shoulders. So no matter what you do, and I really know exactly where Walid is coming from, education and art has failed terribly. And specifically for me, there are no poetic spaces anymore. There are really, for me, no poetry, and that's the most important thing. But going back to Cairo, Beirut, Ramallah, Baghdad, you open a call, and this is realistically, you get 200 people. What you get as students who deserve to be part of the program are participants who graduated from Western institutions. Okay? You ask yourself the second question, and here comes it. Do we open these spaces in our cities for foreigners? And please do not read, please read me with all due respect. I'm not talking about this, but it is almost an intellectual conflict, at least for me as somebody who's been working for the past 19 years in Beirut. If we are going to open these institutions to have only the crème de la crème, why are we doing this work? And then again, we cannot do this work dissociating it by saying, these students have had formal education. And this formal education, why do you assume that you're going to have a great Ministry of Education and a great Ministry of Culture when your Ministry of Economy sucks? Why? I mean, this is a very important question for me. So there should be a reality check here. When we are saying in Cairo, in Beirut, in Baghdad, also there's this educational turn, which is also part of a market, and it became a hype to create these educational institutions because it complements a certain market. So for example, I'm going to talk about this year example. So maybe I have to repeat again, every year we take 13 to 15 students. We have a resident professor. This year the resident professor was Emily Jasser, who's the architect of the year, who puts the themes and invite artists, critics, writers accordingly. We opened the application. We had more than 200 applications, and we were stuck. Like, you're going to invite students from Ramallah. You're going to invite students from Beirut. You're going to invite students from Egypt. These students have a problem of language, first. As Shady said, they don't speak English. Second, all of them have graduated from very poor backgrounds, okay? So you are put in a situation, and it's the same with the Lebanese university, unless you're talking about AUB or talking about Alba or Jesuit. What do we do here? So for me, it is a crisis that continues, but for me, there is hope within this crisis to find certain pockets. And I'm gonna be very pragmatic. So what we decided to do for next year is we have invited 4 students who come from Cairo and Syria, and 2 other students from Beirut, and they really have a problem. They have no notion of what is history of art. So we decided to create foundational courses on history of art. We decided to send them to language institutions. This does not mean that we are going to really, this whole term of pedagogy and education, I think we have to be careful when we use it, because you cannot really educate people. And this shaping is almost fascist in the act of shaping. You do not want to shape. It would only, for me, this whole system, which is eclectic, which is giving possibilities, is the only way of giving these people a possibility of choosing the trajectory that they want to choose. The first thing that my teacher in London told me, Eritrea Goff, when I was studying with her doing my master's in visual of contemporary art theory, she told me you can start anywhere, because I was so obsessed by studying, again, history of art, post-colonial studies. And she said, you can start anywhere, Christine. Forget about the Industrial Revolution. Forget about anything. Just start wherever this makes a connection, a socio-political connection for you. And this is where, for me, at this point now, after 19 years of work, for me, arts, without a connection to the civic and the political sphere, without connected to the creating a civic discourse, becomes a hermetic practice where you are only calling upon 300 people which are coming from all these societies that we're talking on.
Can I actually comment on that also? I'm glad you raised that point, but I think that one of the, I think my voice is loud enough, but I think one of the issues in terms of this issue of applications and what students come through, I think this is also something that is sort of specific to different places, and that needs to be taken into consideration as well. I mean, for example, in Iraq, and I would love to work with the academy more if that's possible. I don't actually think that it necessarily has to be because I do think there was an academy in Baghdad that was very much functioning, that a number of people, artists used to train in from the 50s and beyond. And it was in the past few decades that things really went downhill there. But this whole issue of language also is something that is, there's one level of, this issue of sort of forcing a certain kind of curriculum or whatever it is on students. It's another when, students know that they do not have access to the tools that they want, and a number of the students that we've worked with are asking for certain things. They're demanding those things because those things have sort of been in a state of sort of in a crumbling state, and a state where it's actually used as a means of preventing a lot of work from taking place. And so I think this is also a really important thing to be very cognizant of, is the fact that students in Baghdad actually used to have one of the highest literacy rates in the Arab world. Now, in 10 years, I've seen I've spoken to people who left 10 years ago who are there today. There's almost no comprehension of English at all from a nearly 99% of the same background of students who would be going through the academy who would have had that kind of language background. Also in terms of the materials that are available at the Institute and a lot of these kinds of things, this is something that has been sort of a target of, the occupation, of the war, of the previous regime, all of these different things. And so to sort of also act as though all of this sort of arts learning is happening in the vacuum and nothing never existed there is also false as well. And sort of working on this in a way where you're trying to cut the kind of isolation that is being felt by students or felt by whoever might be practicing in Baghdad in particular and doesn't have access to leaving outside, and no one has access to going inside, is also a very, not only is it isolating, but that itself is a tactic also. And so I think these are also considerations that need to be taken into account when we look at what is being made available to certain students in certain cities and where they live, and what is not being made available to them, and what that means in terms of the kind of information that comes out and the kind of image making that comes out. Because there's a very real, I think, reason why you wouldn't necessarily want to have a lot of work and images and narratives coming out of Baghdad over the past 10 years as opposed to New York City or another kind of capital or place that hasn't obviously had the same kind of history. So these are also part of the site itself.
Coming back to this question of providing certain skills or creating possibilities for certain skills, two things come to mind. One is, of course, Mladen Stilinović's iconic work. I think it is Mladen Stilinović. That it's just a banner that says an artist who doesn't speak English is no artist, which is of course an ironic statement. And then the second thing that comes to mind is Jacques Rancier's a book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, which starts with the experience of a teacher in France in the 18th century, who is being exiled to to Netherlands, and he doesn't speak a word in Flemish. To Belgium, sorry. And what he does is, and he has to instruct students in grammar, in geography, in mathematics, and the students don't speak French. So what happens is that instead of creating this hierarchical relationship between the one who is being instructed and the one who is instructing, which creates an infinite hierarchy of explication, infinite hierarchy between the schoolmaster, the teacher, and the one who is being addressed as a student, Jacotot starts discovering together with the students the connections between various words, connections between numbers, connections after connections between various words are discovered within in the context of grammar. They make connections between sentences together. Finally, they build a paragraph together. So the schoolmaster himself is ignorant, and what happens is that the entire structure of explication is overridden, and thus hierarchy. So I'm wondering, like, why do we need artists who speak English? And another point that comes coming back to Christine's question of why there is no poetry, or why is there little poetry? Maybe because this is my proposition, because we are all trying to either improve institutions or to create sustainable institutions. And I don't know if there can be poetry within institutions themselves. Just some rhetorical questions, but would you like to respond, Shady, or should we? Okay. So we can open up to the audience, yeah?
We can really stop a bit at the expression of art has failed. I think this is a statement that if we don't talk about it, we cannot talk about either education or be skilled or whatever. I think it'd be interesting if we can talk a bit about this. I would be interested.
Do you want to just open up a little bit and we can come back, or?
As you like. If you're ready to respond, you can. Otherwise, we can open it up to.
Yeah, I suppose one can make a general argument, but I'll speak from within the aspirations of my generation, and I've written about this. And I think that without extricating myself from the problem, I think that what happened in Beirut in the last 20 years is that the post-war has produced internationally famous artists against the background of a country, right, that has failed miserably, right, in thinking its future. So for me, when the project of art, which was, as I remember when we began in the early 90s, it was not about becoming great artist or traveling the biennales. It was about art as a unique language with which to think, with which to redeem the past. And instead, we have all become, at different levels, famous artists, but the project itself has failed. And of course, the aspirations were great, right? And of course, we can find ways to justify what happened and to say, well, no, really, what each one of us did make some sort of contribution. But at the risk of exaggerating, and perhaps I am exaggerating the point, it's important to say that the project, the art as a project to impact, the post-war Lebanon has failed. There are few individuals who are doing interesting work, but in general, there's no impact. So it's okay to say art has failed and to start from there. And I'm not against art, right? I mean, I think that it's an important, it is still for me the place where a unique kind of conversation does take place, right? But I'm not riding on a success story simply because I or some of my co-evils have succeeded on the international art market. I make a distinction, right?
Do you think it has failed because of this thing that Hugh became famous internationally, while someone like the artist you are quoting, yes, is still there with his arm and leg covered with gold.
Go ahead. I have to be careful. I don't want to turn the sphere of Imad Isa into what, for example, Agamben has turned the figure of the Muslim in Holocaust concentration camps, right? Like it's the absolute witness because he's the only one who can't speak, right? I don't want to romanticize Imad Isa, but I think as a figure that he does, at least for me, open up the possibility to think again of this temporality of expenditure, how art can be a way to expend yourself rather than a way to build an edifice of yourself. Of course, when in the late 1990s, when money from the European Commission started pouring into Lebanon, everyone, including myself, it was very hard to say no. Some postponed getting into the international art market, but it's very difficult to do so. Of course, interesting texts have been written, interesting exhibitions have been produced, and we have a long history with important moments in it. But it's a complex issue. For example, it's really interesting to think, for example, why just after the 2000s, I mean, it's not that complicated. After the 2006 Israeli war against Lebanon, or against Hezbollah more precisely, I myself, for example, and others received many invitations to write and publish texts in very important magazines. It was a strange moment. It was very hard to say no. Of course, you'd say, I'll take the opportunity and I'll write a good text. And I think we did write good text, but it comes at these junctures, right? Where it's really not about what comes back to the country. It's really, it is the production of individual careers, right? And I don't want to reprimand anyone or myself. I just want to say that let's be aware of this, right? And try to be critical, all the time, right? And not be self-indulgent and congratulate ourselves on art well done or education well done. We're far from that.
Rico?
Anyway, I want to say something that what you're saying, Walid, is correct, that in 2006, all these invitations from magazines and articles that were written on Lebanon, but also what do you think now of what's happening with the Arab Spring? I mean, it's scary what's happening. All these exhibitions that are built, if you talk about the Tahrir art, for example, you go to the Midan al-Tahrir and you see all these arts that have been produced, in the context of, So eventuality, art becomes like press, being a journalist. Whenever you have an eventuality, and this is where you have to really distinguish between art that, as I said earlier, connected to a market, and art that is connected to something that you have been, like you were one of the people in Beirut that you were founding or, trying to think of the future of this country. Of course, I agree with you that we have failed big time, but I don't agree with you that we have failed in the paradigm of art as a facilitation platform, as a knowledge production, as a space for poetry. No, but I do believe, and I do think completely support you that we have failed in that aspect of thinking of where we live.
There's a question here, but before going to Rico's question, would you like to respond to also to this question of pressure to export, in a sense, like not export, but this interpolation of the production of a certain kind of discourse, certain kind of images after the revolution, because you've been dealing with a lot of questions that are both personal but also political in this context.
Yeah, I think also I disagree when art become about media, and I always have that critical point of view about that, especially when we face 11 September in Egypt and the Middle East. We have all those kind of how the media are moving towards us because of what's happening in the media. arts is not. I think that's when the arts become part of the mass media, then it becomes very dangerous, and it affect art as it affect the. Of course, media are affecting everything because they have the money and they have all the concepts and ideas they promoted by those by increasing this kind of ideas. And we are witnessing in Egypt the same, what's happening with us in Tahrir and what's happening with us in before. It's the same. I think it's our role as an artist or as institutions, either academies or educators or artists. I think it's our role to face that direction, which actually we find ourselves motivated because one day we wish that we would be in international art market, and when it comes to us, it's a decision if you are being part of it or accepted or rejected, and go back and start to find your own path to reach the global this idea of being in global space. And I think this is much more challenging and much more creative than accepting and being part of that market because of another system, another project is happening and inviting you to be part of it. So I think it's much more challenging to face that idea. Especially we are always the target. We always having that kind of invitation to be part of that system, which is we are not part of it. That's what I think about, and that's a lot of work happening inside. That's exactly going back to my first idea about working from the ground, and it's the same what I said about education. I think the same it has to be from arts and how we can increase our own language with our own mechanism, and this is something which is extremely difficult because you need institutions, which you need. Of course, you need to understand the other language, which I agree we have to study. That's the thing which is that we all study there, and we studied the language, we studied how that mechanism work. We are being in that art market, and we accept. I agree. We all accept to be part of that because we have that kind of dream. We have that. One day, I want my name to be written in a book. In international book. One day I want my name to be in international magazine. Yes, as a young artist, you're reading in that kind of globe. Yes, you have to agree. But I don't say that because now I decide to step back because I grow up and understand. I find the world more clearly than before. I find that mechanism more clearly. I've been part of it. Then I go back, say no, I don't want to be anymore. And I advise every young artist not to accept, not to be part of that mechanism. Just go back. And of course they refuse. It's nature. I can understand because one day I was like them. But the thing is, I think it's our responsibility, as I said before, that the responsibility of the older, who as expert has more vision, has more clear vision, to start by themselves and to be the example for others.
I just want to add to that really quickly. I think this idea also of failure or narrating fitting into certain narratives, which obviously some narratives are more funded or useful or interesting to different whatever powers might be than others, but I think there's also this basic issue of narrative, and in a lot of areas or in this region in particular where certain narratives are told and only certain and some are censored or some are told in different ways, or there's a sort of lockdown on certain kinds of information. I don't think there's any artists, for example, in Iraq who think that their work is going to be any part of making a difference and rethinking the future. I think it's very clear that, it's going to be whatever you might think, cleansed till it's a giant Exxon Mobil station, whatever it might be. But the fact of the matter is that these narratives sort of document a certain period of time from critical actors who are living in that society, and the number of, for at least in my experience with some of the people there, and then a number of other places, the readings that people have access to are often from artists and different cultural practitioners. So even if there isn't a kind of reimagining of the future or any kind of impact in that way, I think the success actually comes from having a kind of alternate or individually created sort of narrative of a time or a place, whatever that might be. And to me, it doesn't matter if that's, you know, a painting of a scene or whatever it is, or like a concept piece or an installation. The point is that it's actually able to come from the place specifically, which is why I think investing in that kind of whatever kinds of programs might enable it in the place becomes very important, as opposed to necessarily funding other people to come or do certain other kinds of work. And that's where the intrinsic value lies, an idea of, you know, rather than success or failure, I think.
Now I feel bad since Rico left after I deferred his question, but Mahmoud, you're pretty much.
I actually think about, we talked a lot about the failure point, the art as a failure project. But I think when I think about failure in art and education, I think failure as a state is part of our practice as cultural producers somehow. But in education, I think about it in a different way, the failure aspect. Because always when you start an educational initiative, you have your own vision, you have target to reach somehow. So I also wonder about the way you guys think. Like we have like 4 different initiatives for educational initiatives here on the table, and the way you think about how also liberal Western contemporary art schools are failing right now in the West and in the States and in Europe. The schools where we can think about we have like a clear vision about the artisan, the studio practice, and the conceptual practice, and everything is very labeled and everything is very clear. They are also producing a type of student that might be very problematic and might be very shaped and produced in a way. So I don't know to what extent you think about the position of Western sophisticated, so-called sophisticated art institutions, art schools, when you think about your own practice. And also the question for me now, what can we do with especially in our context, in like Beirut, Cairo, Syria, Palestine, with the heavy loaded historically art schools, teaching painting and sculptures. I mean, Shady, you talked about like you working in the system and you're trying to create something within the system itself. Do you think it's enough for your own initiative outside of the system, the organization or the foundation that you're developing right now is another way of doing this? You have been doing this for 10 years and now you decided to open your own thing outside the system. So what do we do with these schools actually?
The terrible fact is that we cannot do anything. So this is the thing. I think this is exactly happening when we talk about Ministry of Culture and alternative spaces. It is hopeless, and I'm talking like that. Maybe it is quite dark, but it is the fact that when you go to visit those schools, and maybe now I'm teaching American University, different. I'm also visiting. I'm not there as a full-time. I mean, like just a visiting professor, but it is not big difference. Yeah, it is not a big difference. So the thing is, when I go back to those academies and schools and talk to students, because actually many of those students they come to the part of those workshops and we're still talking, and I always ask them about what happened now, and is there any new things? They said no, it's worse. It's much worse, and there's no anyone talking to us. There is no one teaching us. There's nothing. We're just spending time following what the professor said, and it's mimicking everything, mimicking art and mimicking them, and so going back to the whole panoramic view of the art scene, and even those institutions we talk about as parallel educational institutions, which take that vision, they know that problem, and they start their own initiatives. I think they also has facing a problem by being, like what you say, being another system, creating another system, which is with that system, when that system grow, it's become problematic itself. So how those parallel or individual, which is not which is doesn't have that heritage of structure, which is actually it's like when the revolution start, the revolution start on the system, on that structure, and actually when we go back and say is that revolution succeed, we said no, because the structure is still there, it's still running by those layers and layers of that heritage. How we can defeat that? This is the main problematic issue. So when you go back and to how what we do with this system, with those structures which is there and having this deep roots in the ground, no, I think we have to do some. I think that's why I'm finding our main problem is creating that research based kind of ideology. Everyone need to think about researching and getting information and experiments, and actually those institutions itself have to follow that road, because this is the only thing which make them change and make the ideology become different every time. They will not. I'm talking about those parallel institutions. They will not fail in the same mistake, that creating that structure would become concrete, and it's creating their own ego, and it's become another problematic. So I think this is what they should do, to give the others more examples to follow. And I believe that maybe with time, with more generation coming, with more awareness of that need, I think they have to do something. And yeah, so this is quite a dark theme, but that's reality.
Two more questions and then we'll wrap it up. First, Tohme, and then.
I'd like to pick up from your idea about not the failure of art, but that we need to start from scratch. I think if art has failed, I think it has failed because it has failed to create a new system of thought. And I think if we stop talking about problems of translation and problems of access, can we think of an education system that actually creates a new system of thought that would adapt to us, that would encourage some sort of local philosophical authority? Would that be starting from scratch in education?
My question is this: do you think art is democratic? If you think so, then there's a set of consequences, conceptual, philosophical. My guess is that at least the figure of Ahmad Isa is a non-democratic figure, and perhaps that's why I'm interested in that figure. The possibility of thinking art as a non-democratic force. Now, of course, the rebuttal would be, but what about, giving access, all that, right? Disenfranchise, ila akhiri. But I feel that would be leading us away from the crux of the matter. If art is to be capable of making changes, right? If the aspiration is to become democratic, then we know we know the story, we know the narrative. Democracy is completely recuperated by neoliberal capitalism. You can have the greatest idea, right? It's easily packaged and diffused. So it's not, when I say art as a non-democratic force, it's not necessarily attacking perhaps the ideals of democracy, right? But maybe the practical applications of it. How can we begin even dare thinking that art is not democratic, right? Maybe this is my scratch rather than come up with a better educational system, right?
One last question from Sarah, and if you have a quick question, you can ask, otherwise we have to wrap up.
I have a more general question it's more about really education, but not in the university setting. Like, we talk a lot about how studies are conducted in university, and also Christine mentioned that Ashkal was faced with a problem where students lack some basic notions on art history and so on. And as a student, I know that in studio arts, a lot of the students who start, they're like a blank page. They don't know anything. They come and they don't really know why. They're there, they're trying, they're dabbling. And I think that one of our problems here in Lebanon is that there is absolutely no opening for children at all.
Schools.
Like, what?
Schools.
Yeah,
Schools.
exactly, schools. Like, I think it's great to provide platforms for university students, but at the same time, do you think anything could or should be done for children to have access to art instead of just starting their education from scratch once they get in university?
Okay, I have two things I would like to say. When we say, when you talk about students not having any sort of history of art, sometimes I say maybe they're lucky, okay? Because there is a possibility. And we say, let's start from the scratch. It reminds me of Christianity. Deleting all sins and starting from the scratch on a new start. And then you are clean. Whatever you have at hand, all the institutions, all the layers, all the historicity, all the narratives, are layers and stratas that we have to deal with. And I want to add more here. I'm still hopeful in a context that is so rotten, and mediocrity and diplomacy are the two keys that have ruled us. I still have hope, and that I believe projects like the projects that are what Wael is talking about, what Shady is talking about, what Regine is talking about, are, for me, poetic spaces. And when I say poetic spaces, I say spaces that have been calculated so much that there's no room anymore for playfulness and fun. And when academia becomes so rigid and so static, this is the spaces that I'm talking about. And when you say there's no openness in Lebanon, you go back to education in schools. That's a big issue that we need to talk about. And then I have to go into economical, post-colonial, capitalistic system. I'm not going to go into that. Who is studying? Who are the people who come to AUB? Who are the people who go to IC? Who are the people who go to Jesuit and Alba? So I'm not going to go into that, but this is something that is really big. And this is where I'm talking about crème de la crème. So if you want to talk about that, I mean, what are schools giving to people? What are students studying in public schools in Lebanon? I'm talking about Lebanon here. So, and starting from the scratch, this is a myth. Okay, this is a myth. You can't start from the scratch. And also, if you want to start from the scratch and clean, and dirt is important. You have to have dirt. And these stratas of dirt are the layers of historicity. And part of it is this unevenness, this, things that are really full of granulation, things that are full of particles, and this is very important. And when we talk about Imad Isa is something that we really celebrate. And, maybe we're talking about him because he doesn't produce anymore, because he's dead. So maybe we have to create another Imad Isa now.
Ideally, we'd go on, but we have to vacate this room. There's another event. But just some closing remarks. If during the first panel discussion on art and value, I was looking to find an elephant in the room, and I found a crocodile. This time I was looking for a crocodile, and I found an elephant. And that elephant for me is the word edification, the edifice that is embedded in every structure, in every institution, and we are all part of the perpetuation of contemporary art as practice, as education, but precisely as edifice. And I'm wondering whether we could rethink this notion of edification, but it's a topic for another panel, for another discussion, and which allows me to transition to an announcement. If you want to hear about edification, you're welcome to join us at the AMCA conference, the Association of Modern and Contemporary Art in the Arab World, Turkey and Iran, on June 1st and 2nd in this building, in a different room. And Bassem El-Baroni will talk about edification. And thank you everyone for coming and sharing your thoughts and participating.